Can corporations help the communities in which they're located? We'll explore this question on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. How can major corporations assist the communities in which they're located? One city, the city of East Palo Alto, put a Measure HH, on the November 2018 ballot that city officials think would enable corporations within the city to boost the city's revenues and help with city services. How? My guest today will explain the measure and discuss what it is designed to do and who benefits from it. Scott Hochberg, seated to my far left, is a workers' rights attorney at Community Legal Services in East Palo Alto. He supports immigrant communities and communities of color striving for workplace justice throughout the peninsula. Scott works towards solutions that remove barriers to economic advancement and is engaged in legislative and policy advocacy with local governments throughout San Mateo County to achieve these goals. Ofelia Bello is seated to my left. Ofelia was born and raised in East Palo Alto and works as a regional planner for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. She is also a commissioner on the East Palo Alto Planning Commission and a board member for Pahali, a local community land trust nonprofit. Karen Camancho is an East Palo Alto resident who works as an organizer and policy advocate at the American Civil Liberties Union of Northern California. She is a member of the Rent Stabilization Board of East Palo Alto. Prior to working at the ACLU, Karen has worked as a tutor and mentor for many East Palo Alto students. Mark Dinan, seated to my far right, moved to East Palo Alto in 2009 and owns Dinan & Associates, a small technical recruiting firm. He actively participates in the community and started East Palo Alto Neighbors, a Facebook group with over 2,000 members. Well, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. It's a delight to have you. So let's talk about the circumstances, first of all, that might have prompted Measure HH. How did it get started?
I can speak a little to that. About probably a little over a year ago now, we as a community saw what felt like rather abruptly the breaking ground of University in Donahoe, where we now see the Amazon building. It's a large office space building, and the way that Amazon came into town felt not only abrupt, but it went around one of the policies that we had in place, which was the first source hiring policy. The same night that it was brought forth.
No. Forgive me for interrupting.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Say something about the first source hiring policy.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So the first source hiring policy is a policy that the city has put in place since the redevelopment era to try its best to encourage local businesses to hire at least 30% of their workforce from the local talent pool, so from local residents. Amazon proposed to do something differently and instead offered a little over $1 million in community benefits and opted to not adhere to the first source hiring policy.
So in the offer for $1 million in community benefits, where would that $1 million go? How would it be used?
Well, you know our town very well, and there's a host of issues that very well merited well over $1 million. There's a water infrastructure issue. There's so many things that $1 million could have gone to, and it simply isn't enough, right, to address everything.
So tell me, wouldn't $1 million be preferable? Why would that not be preferable to maybe hiring community members? Any of you? Scott?
Yeah. So there was a reason why a company like Amazon didn't want to comply with this policy, and it was because they made a judgment about the talent pool in East Palo Alto and what the workers that they thought they were capable of getting. And so instead they proposed a workaround that felt to local residents unfair and very abrupt. And so the money is going to a job development center. But the issue is that there's actually a strong law in place that they didn't want to comply with. And so
The first source hiring.
The first source hiring policy. And so we saw this as a very dangerous precedent for how tech companies are interacting with the local community in East Palo Alto.
Now, the other companies that are there, for example, Target, IKEA, and some of the other companies, San Mateo Credit Union, they're all complying with the first source hiring policy?
To various degrees, yeah. Some are
Four Seasons.
There are some problems with some businesses, but the
They all
majority of them are.
comply.
Can I jump in here? I think you've misstated the first source hiring policy. It's not a requirement, and it's not legally enforceable to hire 30%. It's a requirement to make an effort to hire people. If you look at who Amazon or any professional building or professional environment is hiring, there's no way you could get 30%, and they recognize that. The policy is
Is that just Amazon? Are you saying there's no way other companies or all companies could get 30%, or would it be just Amazon?
It could make sense on a retail level to hire 30%, but even places like the Four Seasons don't comply with that. The requirement is to...
They did start out.
They did start out.
They made the attempt, and Home Depot,
attempt,
Target, and other businesses have been pretty well about at least almost starting to reach it. But
so Amazon could have... What they're doing there is they're building the Amazon Web Services, and they're hiring people with PhDs and master's degrees in computer science. People who are valedictorians in their high school from, Nebraska and Kentucky and India and China, the best and brightest, like all Google and Facebook and Amazon. And they could have run the ads. They could have said, hey, we're hiring, had no applicants from the local talent pool, because either if you are working in that area, in East Palo Alto, you're already employed, right? You're at Google, you're at Facebook, maybe you don't want to go work at Amazon.
No, it could very well be you're a graduating college student.
Yeah, and that's a very hard gig to get, because Amazon is kind of, they have an active program, but they're hiring people with computer science degrees and
But the assumption is that nobody in East Palo Alto, and I think this is what rankled people, that there isn't anybody in East Palo Alto who could qualify. Was that what you were thinking?
That is, yes, that's certainly part of it.
I mean, it was just that was just an automatic assumption.
But let me, the point of first source hiring is you have to make an attempt and you do a report, and there's no legal ramifications for you to do this. So what Amazon said was that we don't think we're going to find database kernel developers living in East Palo Alto, or if we are, it's going to be maybe one or two. This policy doesn't work, and I think where City Council failed is they didn't prepare the community for this.
Okay, now hold on, because what we're talking about is how Measure HH came into being.
Exactly.
So if you'll hold your point for a minute, you were at least saying that this policy, that the first source hiring policy that Amazon avoided, was upsetting to many members of the community. So this is what prompted Measure HH, or prompted some of the other actions that might have ensued?
it prompted what was first and foremost the community gathering together and saying, where do we go from here? If tech companies are stepping into our town and working around the policies that our predecessors worked really hard to put in place, and even if they're not necessarily enforceable entirely or perfectly, they're definitely put in place with a certain intention, right? Like we've crafted all these policies with a specific mission of serving our residents. It brought us together, and it got us thinking, well, if this is already behind us, what can we do now? What measures do we put in place now to make sure we capture some of the value of the office space and office businesses that will be coming into town? But if I can address really quickly, Mark Dinan brought up a compelling point about Amazon came into town and said, potentially, we're looking for the brightest, the best and the brightest valedictorians. I happen to be valedictorian of Edison Brentwood, Edison McNair in Ravenswood District at one point, so you made me remember that. If we're coming in looking for the best and brightest talent, and we're not finding the specific talent at all in that city, I think that begs the question, is this an appropriate industry to bring into town? Is this the sort of job creation that we want to see? I think that's also a part of the discussion, and maybe potentially, I don't know if we're going to get into that part today, but there's a certain level of thought that needs to go into what sort of industries come into town.
Now, Karen, go on, finish your sentence.
Including people who don't have BAs.
Karen, we haven't heard from you, and I'm sure you have something to say on all of this.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a point that even though Amazon decided not to hire from our local talent, I think that we have a lot of recent graduates that are coming back. I have a friend that is working at Facebook that is from East Palo Alto. So I think we do have that talent. I think not enough has been done to seek that talent. And I think there's also a changing trend in which a lot of people that go into the tech industry do not need those BA bachelor's degrees or those advanced degrees. A lot of the top tech executives have dropped out of college.
Like Mark.
Exactly.
And was also Steve Jobs, did he drop out?
Yeah.
Bill Gates, I think.
Bill
Yeah,
Gates dropped out?
They're all dropouts.
Exactly. So I think there is an opportunity for these companies to think about the type of training that they could provide to communities of color that have historically been marginalized and not had access to that education. And I think that's exactly what this measure is trying to target.
Okay, so we've talked about the measure, but we haven't talked specifically in terms of, we talked about how it came into being, but what is it? How did you come up with Measure HH? What does it involve? And we do have a slide that says Measure HH, and that we could bring up so that our viewing audience could at least see something about the measure. That's the argument in favor of, so if we could get the actual slide itself that says Measure HH. But Scott, why don't you go on it? Ah, there we go. Yes, on HH. So talk about what is HH.
So Measure HH takes a look at the forces that are impacting the East Palo Alto community because of the influx of large businesses and tech companies. And we're starting to see some of those trends already, and they're going to get worse in future years. Trends like increased traffic from all of the employees that come in and out of town, pressure on our housing market when new employees have to live around here, which leads to more gentrification and more displacement. So Measure HH imposes a small tax on the very largest businesses located in East Palo Alto. The tax is equivalent to less than 21 cents per square foot per month, and we can talk about exactly what that number means. It applies to only the largest businesses, businesses that are larger than 25,000 square feet.
Now, what businesses, in addition to Amazon, might that involve now in East Palo Alto?
Yeah, there are several in University Circle, some of the large law firms that are located there. But the point of Measure HH is that it's also forward-looking. So we know that more large companies are going to come into the city in coming years as well. And so the point is to raise money through this tax measure and then reinvest it in ways that are going to make those negative effects that we just talked about a little bit better for local residents.
No, that's, so before we move, what are the four? I know there are 4 areas in which the tax measure can be used. What are they?
So the money can be spent by the East Palo Alto City Council in 4 very specific ways. The first is the construction of new affordable housing units and other supportive housing programs. The second one is job training programs in the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, so that local residents can climb the job ladder and get those jobs at tech companies someday. The third is to strengthen East Palo Alto's first source hiring law, which we just talked about. And the fourth is that a small percentage of the proceeds will go to the city staff for the cost that they incur to administer the tax.
So what's wrong with that, Mark?
Well, I'd like to make a correction. The law is aimed at big buildings. It's not aimed at big companies. If you go around high tech, and I've been to hundreds of offices, there's often big buildings with 20 companies in them. So, my idea that East Palo Alto would be attracting startups, and startups might be in a big building and might be subdivided into 25 different spaces. And those are the companies that are most sensitive to price increases. And these are not small price increases. The Amazon building alone would get a $500,000 tax, property tax on it. So that's a large increase.
Now, I have a question for you. These startups are small businesses, and the measure says, and we could look at the measure when they pull up the next slide, that this would be for corporations in a certain amount of space.
No, it's for buildings in a certain amount of space. It's a real estate tax. It's not.
But wouldn't it be, the tax wouldn't be levied on the building, the tax would be levied on the company?
No, it would be
right?
levied on the building.
What, would it be levied on the building or levied on the company?
The tax will be levied on the owner of the building, but from what we know, most leases in this market are called triple net leases. And that means that in addition to paying their rent, tenants also pay the utilities, taxes, and insurance of the developer as well. And so we believe that most of these taxes are going to be passed right on to the tenants in the buildings.
Exactly, and by doing that, what you're saying is we only want large corporations like Amazon and Google and Facebook to be building in East Palo Alto. I mean, the reality is if East Palo Alto is going to have a vibrant, downtown, a vibrant, businesses, we want startups, we want smaller companies to come in because they will go out to restaurants, they'll go and they'll use local services because Google will give you a massage. A startup, if you want to get a massage, you've got to go to a massage place and get it. Maybe a spa that would offer that. And I think East Palo Alto should be focused on attracting startups and other smaller companies that aren't going to be these big closed-off campuses. What this tax does is it really incentivizes companies like Amazon and Google to come in because I've been in the room when we're making decisions on where to go with companies because I've seen a lot of real estate. I have a lot of different clients in different areas, and they ask me, okay, where should I be located? And you've got to look at a variety of issues, but cost is always present for small and mid-sized companies.
Karen,
Yeah.
How would you respond?
Mark, I think I definitely want an East Palo Alto that has a vibrant downtown and a great, sense of community. But one thing that we need to consider is that the development that is happening right now is going at such a fast rate that we are not addressing the issues that this development is causing. And I think what this measure is doing is it's saying, let's take a pause, let's look at the issues that are going to be down the pipeline, and let's try to address them now before we bring in all of these companies that are in the pipeline, all these new developments, I meant.
So you think the tax is trying to stop development?
It's not. It's trying to address the issues that will occur once development comes, because development will be inevitable. Of course,
I don't think it is.
So let me ask a question. You're familiar with the TOT, Transit Occupancy Tax, right?
That applies to hotels.
Yes, that applies to hotels. Now, there was a certain percentage that the tax that the hotel pays to the city every year. And this tax went into the funding of nonprofits, and it also went into the funding of some of the police programs. You're not familiar necessarily with the specifics of that. Okay, I was thinking of that as perhaps an example of how taxes are used for the betterment of the community. So
no, I think you're right, and I think East Palo Alto residents already are paying a number of taxes that are going into the betterment of the community. There's sales tax, there's a gross receipts tax that some businesses are paying, there's the first source hiring law that a lot of businesses are complying with. What this tax is designed to do is to bring the really large businesses into the equation too. And if I could just make a point about the size of this tax relative to the size of the companies that we're talking about. Amazon, for example, is the largest, the most wealthy company in the world. It's now valued at $1 trillion or over. This tax is 1/4 per square foot per month. So even over Amazon's large building, this is a drop in the bucket compared to their overall revenues. And there's a reason why Amazon doesn't oppose Measure HH, because it barely registers on their radar screen. Likewise, there's a similar tax to the one we're proposing in Mountain View that Mountain View voters are going to decide in November. And Google has not spoken out against that tax either. And the reason is the same, because the amounts that we're talking about are so minimal, and to believe that they are going to switch the decision-making of a large company or even a smaller tech company is absurd.
That's totally wrong. I disagree strongly. I've talked to people who have built buildings, and what you have to realize about East Palo Alto, it's been 15 years since we've had a apartment building built that any of us could be living in. Developers have stayed away from East Palo Alto because it's really hard to do business here. We don't have a good planning department. There's been a constant turnover. There's been a variety of technical issues, blueprints being lost, permits being lost, things like that. There's a big empty lot across the street from City Hall that we all see whenever we're at functions there, and there's no compelling reason for developers to build in East Palo Alto right now. I mean, there's been the water issue that has prevented development. My concern with this tech tax is if we just don't do anything, this HH is not implemented, you're going to have $10 million in revenue. If this slows development or stops development anyway, which I think is a real possibility, you're looking at a situation where the city's going to lose, it's like eat one marshmallow now or eat 10 later.
Yes, but you know what? I think that's an assumption.
It's
and
also
I don't know that you have any facts. I'd like to see.
There's not been a fiscal analysis on this.
But wait a moment.
All.
Yes, but if there hasn't been, then I think it's not possible to say that the city's going to lose money because we don't have any evidence of that whatsoever.
The reason why this should not be on the ballot is because they have not done a fiscal impact statement. There's a lot of issues in East Palo Alto developing that I was unaware of. For instance, our horrible infrastructure. We need to have $300 million in investment just to. If you're at a Cooley Landing, the toilets don't flush because there's not a good sewer system there, and they're constantly having problems there. So these are all things that developers are going to have to deal with in East Palo Alto that they don't have to deal with in Menlo Park.
So do you know what? If the companies do come in and they're taxed at, what, 21 cents per square foot?
Less than 21 cents.
Then that money raised would enable the city to fix the infrastructure.
Not
necessarily,
not
only in those 4 areas.
Correct.
Okay. But would it not be better, rather than to assume that this tax would end development, and if there hasn't been any development, as you said, before the tax was imposed, why would we necessarily assume once this tax of 21 cents per square foot is going to impede development?
Well, it's a good question, but I think developers as well are looking at this and saying, look, we opened one building, a Sobrato, and by the way, Amazon doesn't own any of these buildings, they're leasing them, that there's the presumption that if this goes up once, it could go up again. It's opening.
That's inaccurate.
Yes, but I read the measure myself, and the measure does say how the city could decrease it.
They could decrease it,
that's
but
right.
Depending on, and it seems to me, if it's that injurious, the city could not enact it, right? If that the city has the power to look at what's going on and decide, do we increase it, do we decrease it, do we keep it the same? That it's not something that's fixed, is it?
That's right.
Yeah, so the city, if economic conditions change in the future, the city can, at their own discretion, lower the tax rate. They could lower it all the way down to 0. They cannot increase it without, again, sort of seeking voter approval through another ballot measure.
So it seems there is that flexibility, Mark.
there is the flexibility, but there's also the flexibility of bringing up another measure like this. For instance, Google's been in Mountain View 20 years. This is the first time they're bringing up the idea of taxing Google. East Palo Alto.
But what's wrong with that?
These
are multi-billion-dollar companies.
East Palo Alto is not Mountain View, and we're not.
No, it's not.
We need to attract investment.
No,
not
it's not. But
redirect,
evidently, the fact that Mountain View, a much more affluent city, is thinking of imposing a tax, says that this might be a viable way to go.
I think it would make a lot more sense to look at something like this after 5 years had gone by and there's all these buildings built, and
More people are displaced.
they're already established. You know, this tax isn't going to do anything to fight displacement.
But you don't know that. You don't know that.
there-
You don't. You know, you said that there hasn't been any studies done
There have
ahead of
not.
time. So you don't have anything really concrete to base your opinion on, do you? It's your opinion.
It's my opinion, but you know, if we tax corporations and let's say office buildings don't go in, the displacement is going. The way to fight displacement is by having high-density housing and encouraging development and having 12-story apartment buildings that have a affordability component
So
to
where
them.
is the money going to come from for high-density housing?
It's by working with developers and getting them to build it, and having a 15% below market.
Now,
unit, and
there
that-
is something called community benefits,
Yeah.
and companies have come in offering willingness, like Amazon, to offer some type of community benefit. So can't this be seen as a community benefit, which companies are already open for doing?
Well, the way, you know, the big picture on this one is that if this slows all of this development that's in
But
planning,
that's an assumption. We
It's an
have,
assumption.
We have no evidence
And
whatsoever
it's
that
a-
it will slow anything.
it's a huge assumption to say that it won't slow it. 'Cause
But
we
it
just
seems
don't-
to me it's as huge or even more to say it's going to slow it and then not do anything, because there is the assumption that it's going to slow it when we don't have any evidence. Now, I'm doing the talking. What about the three of you?
I have, yeah, if I can jump in a little. I think we keep, it's really great to hear this dialogue, and I think just in listening, we keep dancing around, but not addressing the fact that development hasn't happened in East Palo Alto to the extent that it has in other affluent cities for a long time. And it's a big elephant in the room to not go ahead and address that developers have chosen, investors, ever since East Palo Alto was redlined, have actively put in place, there have been actively policies put in place, and there have been very racially connotated reasons why developers don't want to be in East Palo Alto, all the way from redlining, and even before then, to up until the 90s, like the perception of crime, and even fairly recently, on your page, there are people asking, is it safe for me to walk to the library? And that's potentially, you know, starting to change now, but I think one of the things that's important to remember is that we all agree that on some of the goals that we want to see, or some of the things we want to see happen in East Palo Alto. We want a vibrant downtown. We want a fun downtown. We want more commercial. We want more neighborhood serving retail. All of these things, like the what is not the issue, it's the how. And considering how development has typically happened, not only in the city and the region and nationwide, for how it's happened and impacted specifically communities of color, how is it that we can expect to keep doing the same thing, or to let the free hand of development keep doing the same thing and expect different results, especially in communities like East Palo Alto? That just doesn't make sense. Like, it's imperative that we intervene through a very modest 21-cent tax per square foot per month. Like, that's not asking a lot. Like,
Have you, oh, I'm so sorry,
Can I just
Karen.
provide an example? I think there are examples where when the community is involved in the decision making over what type of development is created in the city, you have a lot of great improvement for the community. So one example is the Fruitvale station was being developed
In Oakland.
in Oakland. BART was being expanded to Fruitvale, which has a large minority population, and the community worked in conjunction with the developers, and they created the station that has a wonderful plethora of services, legal services, everything that the community needs on different levels. There's housing. So I think there are opportunities for our city to have development, and we just need to think about the type of development that we do want.
Is there a city that you know of that has enacted a measure similar to Measure HH?
San Francisco.
Talk about it.
San Francisco voters in June passed a similar tax on large commercial office space, and they dedicated the money to child care and education programs.
Do you know how much the tax was?
I don't know the amount of the tax, but it was also a modest amount, like like we're talking about here.
Do you know anything about the opposition to it? Or the city enacted it, did it go to a vote of the community?
Yep, voters passed it in June 2018.
Do you know to what degree, to what percentage?
Over 50%.
Okay. So, Mark, what would be wrong if there's flexibility that the city has of going on, enacting the tax, and then seeing what happens? If they could always not put it into effect or lower it.
I think the issue is right now when there's a lot of uncertainty in any sort of planning environment, especially when you're talking about the economy, you're talking about demand.
Isn't there always uncertainty?
There's always uncertainty,
Always.
and
there's nothing certain in the economy.
But just here's a just in the last 6 months, interest rates have shot up, right? So financing costs for any construction are going to be double or triple that they would have been, even like 2 or 3 years ago. There's the era of kind of free money is ending. To Scott's point, though, I don't think you can compare San Francisco and East Palo Alto. East Palo Alto has 0.2 jobs per resident, and San Francisco has something like 4 or 5. San Francisco during the day is a city of like 3 million people, and at night it goes down to 800,000.
But can we look at the impact that the tax might have had on San Francisco? Just looking at the impact.
Oh, I think you can do case studies, and I think the danger here is I'm not opposed to a tax like this down the road. I'm saying right now where we're trying to attract investment into East Palo Alto and get $1 billion of stuff built, commercial office space, housing especially, this is not the time to do it. And
now, I have a question for you. You might very well attract the companies like Facebook, but what would be the impact on the community? For example, when Facebook, shortly after it came in, the company was offering its employees $10,000 to move closer into East Palo Alto. So,
well, they stopped that policy.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
But if you have
The
companies,
pressure of community.
but if you have companies coming in, given right now the 2-hour or more commutes even tech workers have to make because they can't live closer, if you have something like that going on, what's going to prevent the increase in pressure on the housing market before there can be any counterbalances that increase the housing?
I would say to answer that question, if we're concerned about displacement in East Palo Alto, which we all are, the answer to this is not to try to keep tech out, because we're not going to succeed. You mentioned Facebook. We've got Google, Apple, a bajillion other companies. And right now, they're driving through East Palo Alto and they're going on. The way to address that is to work with developers and get high-density housing and get
Okay, now,
increase
question
the
for
supply.
you. You said you're not going to stop tech companies, which means Measure HH might not
No, that's
stop
not what I said. You're not going to stop tech companies
from moving
in the
in.
region.
Yes,
But
from doing what?
But it doesn't mean they're going to move into East Palo Alto.
Okay, I think you were going to say something.
Yeah, so Mark is concerned about stopping development in East Palo Alto. It's an admirable concern. But I think we just need to keep in mind the facts on the ground here. The fact is that unemployment is at an all-time low, the lowest rate in decades, 3.9%. The GDP is extremely high. The vacancy in commercial areas in Silicon Valley are at all-time lows, which means that there's a huge demand for office space in this area. And what that means is the East Palo Alto is still one of the ripe targets for development in the region. It's one of the places that still has large undeveloped tracts of land. Laureen Powell Jobs just bought dozens of acres of land in East Palo Alto a few months ago. None of the big developers like Sobrato have told the city that they're not going to. In
fact, the office building that I'm located in is going to, Sobrato has plans to demolish it and build something else. So
Exactly.
I'm going to be one of those companies looking for office space.
We'll let you know if we hear of anything.
Thank you so much.
But the point is that East Palo Alto is still a red target for development in what's the hottest real estate market that this area has ever seen. And so the argument that this, again, less than 1/4 of a tax is going to deter folks from wanting to move into the area just doesn't hold much water.
21 cents on even small companies? Would it make that much of a difference? I used to
So-
have an
so like-
office that was 400 square feet.
So like we said, this is 25,000 square feet.
Oh,
Are
it has
the
to
only
be.
people that would pay this tax. So retail businesses in East Palo Alto would not be affected. People's homes would certainly not be affected. It's only the largest of the large buildings that we want to pay their fair share.
The tax on the Amazon building over the course of a lifetime would increase its cost by about 20 million. So
Over the course of a lifetime means what?
I don't know where
20
that number
years,
comes from.
40 years.
40 years.
40 years.
What would it do in the immediate future? Not looking at 40 years.
You know,
which-
Red Hat.
let's look in the immediate future. What might that mean for Amazon? Do you know how many square feet Amazon is right now?
200,000.
I think that's right.
Okay, I don't have a I could pull out my calculator. Do you know 21 cents on 200,000?
It's
what that-
500,000.
But Henrietta,
per year.
the point is not the actual dollar amount. The point is relative to the size of the company and their profits. They could care less about a tax this size, which is why they haven't even gone through the trouble of formally opposing it or giving any statement about it. So to claim that companies like Google or Facebook or Amazon are going to be seriously impacted by Measure HH is just not really taking the scale of what we're trying to do into account.
So, Mark, how would you explain, Scott just said, none of the companies that are aware of Measure HH have posed any arguments against it?
Well, they're in a tricky political situation, and I understand why they're against it. They're not coming out.
How do you know?
Because I've talked to them, and I'm not going
I'll
to.
take your word for it.
Yeah, they're strongly against this because
Now, Scott, have you talked to them? Ophelia, have you talked to them?
I can proudly say that I don't have a ton of daily contacts with the Facebook and Amazon and Google executives.
Karen, have you talked to them?
I definitely have not.
So I guess what we can really only go on is what's on the record. Now, you were saying it's a
Well,
difficult...
Mark says he has close contacts with the
and
tech
it's
industry.
a difficult political climate. Why would they not?
well,
if
they're
this
trying
were-
to get stuff built, and you don't. If you're Lean Palo Jobs, you're not going to go out and say that you are against this, but
Why not?
it's the politics, local politics. If you want to
But
get things
tell me,
approved.
if I'm a company and this is really going to affect my bottom line, why wouldn't I come out right now and say I'm opposed to this?
I
And
think
bring
you-
your performance and show.
And given all of the money that they have, distribute leaflets throughout the community,
I think
have
you-
people going door to door.
I think you'll see that, but they have. I mean, the guy who's in charge of the Ravenswood Business District is the one who wrote the opposing point to this. And it's not to say that it's going to stop all development. There's still going to be stuff happening, but what it does throw into question is some of these large lots, like the former Romek lot, which I think is 8 acres. The only thing that makes sense there is large, what it's zoned for is large commercial buildings.
So tell me
And-
something, hold one second. Companies coming in now, isn't there some type of a requirement negotiated with them for community benefits?
What's negotiated one-on-one.
It happens on a
Wow.
case-by-case basis occasionally, to the extent that the community pressures them to do
But
it.
this is already something that the community does with companies that come in,
No,
large
this
companies
process
that come
didn't
in.
happen when Amazon came in. There was no discussion with the community.
But it has happened prior to that. For example, it happened with Facebook. I know it happened with Facebook.
It certainly happened with Facebook. There was a legal issue involved that prompted them to engage with the community.
So I'm just thinking, were you gonna say something? Because
I was going to say they're obliged to whatever the land is zoned for, that's what they'll do. Why would developers go out of their way to provide additional community benefits when they're in it for profit? So to the point that they'll be losing money or it's unfeasible, they can bring forth their performance. Like you said, why are they not like show us the margin of profit that you'll be losing or whatever it is that doesn't add up, that doesn't pencil out, as people like to say. But were you posing a different question?
Well, I was just thinking if the city has a policy of negotiating with companies anyway in terms of community benefits as they move in, that there is some expectation from all of the corporations that move in that they have to give something back to the community.
That's going on the presumption that they're coming in good faith, that they're coming in saying, we want to be a good neighbor.
No, 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 no. It's the city, isn't it, that has to negotiate with the companies to make sure that there is some type of good faith relationship that has been established or is being established.
No, that's not true. There's a large coalition of community groups in East Palo Alto that are active for standing up for what local residents care about, but there's no requirement that a
They
company
don't have to.
has to negotiate with the local community, and we've seen in many cases they don't want to.
And in fact, the city council doesn't have to necessarily, or they haven't always advocated for what residents want. They're in those positions of power to call the shots, right? So like the point that I was trying to get across is developers are obliged to follow the rules that are written in the books, the zoning that has been laid out for the city, and that's it.
No, the city does have local ordinances affecting the zoning and affecting requirements mandated for companies coming in, right? So the city could very well make an ordinance, establish an ordinance that would guide such a policy. The city has the right to do that.
I think we're in a position to be really forward thinkers in the way we do development. East Palo Alto is in the place where, like I mentioned before, people have not wanted to develop in town for a really long time. We're now in a place where we can negotiate how development happens moving forward. And we are now in a place where we can negotiate and ensure that it happens equitably. So to your point, I think there's plenty of opportunity to do that. We can revisit the specific plan, make sure, like recalibrate it. There's a lot of introduce new policies, perhaps ordinances, whatever it is that it takes to make sure that we are serving the residents of East Palo Alto is certainly a step that we can take.
So do you think, I'm wondering, Mark, do you think a company should be obliged to offer community benefits? If it's going to be in, it's making a profit, it's using the resources of the community, it's adding to the traffic impact, using the water, should there not be some expectation that it's beneficial to the community?
Well, I think HH puts a lot of these community benefits at risk. There's no legal requirement for Amazon, or it's actually Sobrato that's paying for the...
But wait a moment, you said putting these community benefits at risk. What community benefits are we talking about?
For instance, Sobrato is funding the job train center at inside the Amazon building, and if they're going to be paying increased taxes, they can pull the funding for that building. There's no legal requirement for them to be doing
So
that.
do you think they would be doing that if it's 21 cents per square
It's
foot?
$500,000 a year. It's
And
for that
how
building.
much profit are these companies making, Sobrato, with buildings?
Oh, I'm sure they're making a lot of money, but the question is if the property tax is going to be significantly higher in East Palo Alto than Sunnyvale, and that gets passed on to the tenants, then do people want to do business in East Palo Alto? But getting back to your...
No, sorry, Henrietta, I have to address that. So East Palo Alto commercial tenants pay less in rent than the neighboring cities of Palo Alto and Menlo Park. The point of HH is not to raise East Palo Alto's tax rates above those other cities. It's to close that gap, because right now businesses are getting something for nothing. They're paying less in taxes by
Do you
being
have
in
any
East Palo
numbers
Alto.
to give us?
Commercial tenants in East Palo Alto pay between, it's different for every business, but they pay between a range of $6.50 and $10 per square foot per month, which actually, just as a side note, is a nice comparison with the 21 cents additional that we're asking
So
them to
do you
pay.
know what's being paid in Palo Alto or Menlo Park?
The average that I've heard is higher than that. And our neighboring cities can sometimes go up to $13 per square
So
foot.
East Palo Alto is about 80% of what Palo Alto is in terms of what the Amazon building. So Amazon moved in because they got a deal. But also think about what you get when you're in downtown Palo Alto. You get a vibrant downtown. You don't have anybody asking you about why do you have jobs in the murder capital of the world.
Which it isn't.
It is
No,
not.
it's not.
isn't.
It's
In
absolutely
fact,
not.
Yeah, things have changed tremendously.
Tremendously, but the reputation hasn't, unfortunately. We all know at this table that the murder rate has fallen like 98%, and that EPA is safe and considerably safer than where you live in
And
San
that
Francisco.
reputation is getting out too.
It is getting out, but I was at
But there's so many pressures now for space.
But the point is, though, if you're renting in downtown Menlo Park or downtown Palo Alto or any of these other places, you have all these amenities that East Palo Alto does not have. It should be cheaper in East Palo Alto for now. At some point, it should be at parity. But the point is, if you're a scrappy startup and you're looking for a good deal on real estate, East Palo Alto should be that place.
And it is. Currently, it really is.
We don't have startup space there's no business space here other than we have 3 office
So,
buildings.
Mark, what makes you think, you said 5 years down the line, what makes you think it's going to be possible to enact something like this 5 years down the line, given how uncertain the economy is, or given the pressures, I mean, the changing population, and isn't it better to do it now?
I think
Evidently, yes.
No, I think we should encourage the developers to spend their money, spend $1 billion in East Palo Alto. We should talk about things like extending a BART line into East Palo Alto and building more high-density housing and getting a lot of this investment. And by doing this, we're sending a clear signal to developers that we don't want office buildings in East Palo Alto. And that
is this sending? Is that an overstatement that this is sending a clear signal?
Of course it is. There's right now over 1.8 million square feet of office space in the pipeline that's in various stages of being approved by the City Council. There's the 2020 Bay Road building. There's the Columbia property project on the corner of University and Woodland. There's the new Sobrato building, the primary school. And so development is happening. And to argue that, development will stop it's just not accurate given what's happening in town.
I don't think that's accurate. I think at any point developers developers can pull the plug on this at any point.
What's
but none have
not,
to date, right?
What's not accurate?
To say that because it's in the planning phases that it's going to get done. I mean, anybody who's lived in Silicon Valley for more than a little bit knows that there's economic cycles, and something like the economy collapsing like it did in 2001 could absolutely put stuff on hold, and we'd have empty, construction sites for
Now
4
that
years
could
at a
happen
time.
with or
Regardless,
without Measure H.
Yeah, it could happen with or without. And so when you add these fees onto it, it adds another layer of cost, another layer of expense. And
But it's another layer of cost for major corporations that seems to be minuscule. 21 cents, if we're talking 21 cents
the
per
people
square
building
foot.
these buildings are not Sobrato. They're not Google. They're not Facebook. Now, John Sobrato is a very wealthy man, but right now, what East Palo Alto, with all these costs, we're not just competing against Sunnyvale and Santa Clara and Palo Alto and Menlo Park. Sobrato, I think I looked him up. I didn't realize he's worth $6.8 billion, right? We're competing with Austin, Texas, and Denver, Colorado, and
Yes, so you know what? When you're competing with places like that, if they're going to go to Austin, I don't know that 21 cents per square foot is going to make a difference.
or $500,000 a year for a building. I mean, that's $5 million over 10 years.
But you know what? If they have other options in the Bay Area, then they would go there rather than going to Austin. So I don't know that.
That's a great point, and it brings up, why was this measure rushed? Why wasn't there an analysis of how this is going to impact everything? Where we can all say, okay, professionals have analyzed this in a way that none of us at the table are capable of, and saying this is what's going to.
Was this measure rushed?
This measure was formally brought to the public's attention in January 2018, so 9 months ago. It's been publicly discussed at city council meetings since then, over 5 to in my records, and that was actually more time than the city of Mountain View publicly discussed their policy. So there's been plenty of time for opponents to weigh in and have their voices heard. Some of them have been, but it's been studied. Mark is right that there hasn't been a formal, thorough economic impact study, and I think we should address that for a second. The reason that study would likely not have the conclusive effects that you think it would is because there are many assumptions that have to be made in a report like that. Whoever designs it would have to project years down the road what economic growth looks like in Silicon Valley, what the demand for real estate would be, what interest rates would be, all of these things. And the more presumptions you put in a report like that, the less conclusive it is. And so even if a report like that had been done, it wouldn't have provided the level of concreteness that would have been satisfying. And so then we go back to the facts that we've already talked about that we all know, which was that we're in an extremely hot real estate market, that the economy is very, a lot is happening right now. And in the off chance that in the coming year something changes, as we've talked about, the city can easily reduce the rate of this tax.
Ofelia, you've been quiet.
I mean, it's interesting to hear Mark talk about development needs to happen and will happen. And the only thing that I can think about is not at the expense of the people who have helped build this city, not at the expense of vulnerable residents who are already suffering from the increased land value and are having to pay unreasonable rents and are having to commute really long commutes and contributing increasingly more GHGs to our deteriorating climate, like
GHGs.
Not at the expense greenhouse gas emissions. Not at the that's a really expensive stack of collateral damage, and that's not the kind of development. Back to my point about equitable development, that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for solutions that are transformative and will ensure that everyone thrives. Like, sure, certainly we want some tech development and a variety of businesses, but again, not at the expense of people who have been in the city for a really long time and who have made it the vibrant cultural place and desirable place that it is today.
Now, I have a question, Mark, before you comment. If you're going to bring in all of the tech companies and a lot more development, that's going to put more demands on the streets with the traffic impacts. It's going to require more water. And so who's going to be paying for the additional resources?
Well, the property taxes.
Wouldn't that be the city?
Those are really good questions. I mean, things that need to be planned. With the new development, the 1.9 million square feet that we're talking about here, that would bring in about 10 million per year in property taxes, which hopefully you'd be able to address this stuff. But housing and traffic and transportation are huge issues. I'd love to see the City Council of East Palo Alto start talking about a strategic vision that would extend BART across the bay to East Palo Alto and be able to take a lot of the traffic off the road. I'd love to start them talking about raising height limits so we have 12-story apartment buildings instead of the 3 and 4 stories we have. I'd love for them to talk about biking and increasing bike networks so that we can get more people out of cars. And
I think they have done that.
They
have
have
biking days that
yeah,
the city has every year, Bike to Work Day.
No, but we're talking, it's unsafe to bike, even to Facebook, which is super close by. Google is cut off right now. It'll be easy bike ride, but that's a total different conversation.
Now, can't the city do all of that and still pass Measure HH?
I think we don't want to send a signal to developers that we don't want them, and this is the clear signal that HH is sending, is that we're going to make it difficult for you to develop and not lose money in East Palo Alto.
Karen.
I feel like at the end of the day, we're talking about the people in our community and the impact that all the issues that are happening in the city with traffic, lack of affordable housing. And I think one thing that we need to remember is what is our city composed of, and the diversity of our city I feel like is really at stake at this moment, and we really need to think about how can we keep our residents, a lot of whom are low income, a lot of whom need affordable housing at the lower levels of poverty, and we're not doing anything to address those issues. And I feel like there's so many community advocates that are talking about the RV situation and second unit housing, and we just need to make sure that we're able to address these issues. And right now we don't have the funding to be able to address those issues. And I think, like I mentioned, this is what this measure will address.
Can I just add one thing too?
Of course.
So just to respond to a point that Mark made, that the city is going to lose $10 million in revenue if they pass Measure HH. So
There hasn't been any impact assessments
no,
made,
no.
right?
But even if that's right, like even if I grant that that number is right, property taxes collected by the city don't all get kept by East Palo Alto. They're shared
That's right.
between cities and counties and the state. And so of that, East Palo Alto would only get about 30%, so $3 million. HH, you know, if it passes in November, will start to raise $1.6 million. So that gap is much, much smaller. And then over time, the amount of money that HH raises will actually surpass $3 million. But I think hearing kind of a theme from this conversation, a lot of arguments against Measure HH basically boil down to, in my opinion, let's give developers every single thing that they want, every last incentive and tax break, and that's the only way that they're going to develop projects in East Palo Alto. And that's just, I think the three of us fundamentally disagree with that statement. We want development. As we've talked about, it's already happening. We're not going to be able to stop it. But we want development that's centered on our community and that doesn't involve displacement. And is Measure HH going to solve the housing crisis in East Palo Alto? No. Is it going to solve traffic? No. But it's going to put us on a path to be able to start to address those problems. And that's why we're supporting
So
it.
Karen mentioned the diversity of the community and maintaining the diversity. Why is that important? And why should that be a factor?
I mean, just looking at, like I mentioned a little earlier, the way that development has happened for centuries, but perhaps since the inception of this country, the way that the path that we've clearly chosen as a nation, and which is emphatically being reflected right now at the national level, it is not just our responsibility, it is our moral obligation to make sure that we preserve and protect the communities that have been most vulnerable in this country. And when we're residents of East Palo Alto, that starts with home.
Famous last words.
People over profit, all day, every day.
Mark, in 2 seconds.
I don't think HH, there's going to be a lot of unintended consequences with this, and I think we really have to think hard before we move forward.
Okay.
Development without displacement.
Let's
That
think
part.
about our community.
Well, we have a lot of issues that we've thrown out in terms of Measure HH, and it's going to be up to the voters to decide, and we hope we've given you two sides of the issue to take into consideration when that decision is being made. I'd certainly like to thank the four of you for sitting here sharing.
Thank
so
you,
much.
and
And
to
I'd like
everyone
to-
watching, please vote November 6th.
I'd
Yes,
like to
vote.
thank the voters, for, the viewers for watching.
And voters, hopefully.
Until next time. That's it.
That was fun. Thank you for having us.
But of course.